Oh yeah, hello, this is Michael. I think this is the nighttime here passing over from Thursday, February 2nd, 2023 to Friday, February 3rd. And I was resting or sleeping. I probably fell asleep early. I saw a movie at 5 o'clock at the local movie cinema here, and then probably drifted off around 7:30 in the evening. And now, last time I checked, it's probably around midnight or after midnight. Looks like it's almost 1:45 here. So, this is how I started with these YouTube videos where they were just sort of accidental. I was fiddling around with my phone one day about 5 months ago, and I'm used to having things on there rejected, and somehow a video I made got uploaded to the internet. That was the first time I ever saw that, and then I figured out how to upload videos to YouTube, which is not the same as a TV station. It's the internet, as you know, with plumbers on it and roof repairmen, private contractors, regular citizens. It's so at that time I was living in Houston, and as I've complained before, a voice from outer space was waking me up and having me describe things, and I put some of that on the internet under a heading of FBI. So it's doing the same thing again here tonight. It wants me to describe things where I've already described them, and they're not at newspapers where I'm used to working, or they're not literary. They're things that I have little to do with, and I've done this before. It's in other longer videos that are longer than shorts or longer than 1 minute. So the main thing one thing it's complaining to me about is for the past 2 years, this voice from billionaires and millionaires has been complaining that I'm a politically slanted person or a political person, and unfortunately or fortunately, that is not true, or I have no evidence of that. As I've said before in these videos, I have no special relationship that I know of to politics or book publishing or to newspaper work or to anything that I know of. But as I've said before, in elections, I have not campaigned publicly for a candidate since the 1970s, when I campaigned for one night or one weekend or something, doing telemarketing work for, at that time, the liberal Democrat Morris Udall. Anyway, since then, I have no record of being successful voting. I voted for 3 Democrat presidents once each who have been elected. And of course, I voted for a number of Democrats who were not elected. So I don't seem to control elections or influence them or anything like that. On the Republican side, I voted once apiece for 2 Republican presidents who have been elected, and I don't seem to have any control or special or anything. So I voted for 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans who've been elected president, once apiece with all of them. So in other words, I voted for a number of Democrats and Republicans who were not elected. I tend to think of myself not as a person in the middle, but as a person who votes case by case, person by person. And it's just a matter of, if I know about the election, if I've read about it, if I feel comfortable voting for that person. As I said the last time, our family really has not been involved in politics in a long time. Throughout most of my mother's and father's lifetime in the Fox Point homes where I lived, I did not see any politician signs out in our yard. And as you know, it's nowadays suburbs in America, it's red tape. You're supposed to get permission from the local village government, and that's months in advance or years in advance. So I've never seen a political sign at any house that I've lived at where our family has owned it. Unfortunately, this is a real bad time for the Voice to be accusing me of influencing elections. I have no evidence that I've ever influenced any election. I have most of my writer experience has been as an editor at small town newspapers, and I can only recall one person at one newspaper ever asking me seriously if I was a Democrat or a Republican. And I just continued, I did not answer the question. I was talking about something else, and I just continued talking about the newspaper or whatever. But only one person has ever asked me. I can't recall ever having met a person who thinks I'm a Republican, and I don't recall meeting many people or any people who think I'm a Democrat, or only a couple people have ever asked me if I was a Democrat, and I don't think I ever answered that. I just was talking about something else at the time. So, but it has been for the past 2 years here in Florida, this voice from outer space. It's bothering me now more here in this spot because I'm not real far away from the Kennedy Space Center. And, but the closest relationship that our family, the Kajowskis and Obermeyers, had to politics was way back in, I think it was the 1950s or 1960s. We were friends or acquaintances of the National Democrat congressman from Milwaukee, Clement Zablocki. And the reason was my father was in the 25-year club at Schuster's Gimbel's department store in downtown Milwaukee. He worked there 25 years, and he couldn't take it anymore. He had had enough. But while he was there at Schuster's, the biggest department store in that era in downtown Milwaukee, he had a co-worker named Clement Zablocki, and my father, I believe, worked in cameras and music recording, selling music, record players, and records like Frank Sinatra records and Elvis records, and also selling photographic equipment, cameras and movie cameras and movie screens and stuff like that out of the department store. And so what was I saying? There was a co-worker there that he had, also a floor salesman named Clement Zablocki, and at one point Zablocki ran for U.S. congressman, was elected, and we were invited to his house in Washington, D.C. So on one of our family vacations, which my father could afford back in those days in the 1960s when my sister and I were just toddlers, we visited Clement Zablocki's real nice, new, modern Washington, D.C. home, and if my memory is correct, I believe we slept there one night and spent one day there, and it was in a wooded area, suburban area near Washington, D.C. or Virginia or whatever, and it was a nice a nice home with a wooded lot, a large home. So that was our closest, our family. I believe recently some of my relatives have, if I ask them, I believe the past recently in this, because I'm getting older here, recently in this means the past 10, 15 years, I've maybe inquired a few relatives, and I believe they've said they vote Republican. However, an average relative of ours has been dying in here. We're getting older. Many of my relatives live in the range of 73 to 78. We don't vote. We don't live anywhere near 100. Most of my relatives, and an average relative of mine, a blood relative, is 73 to 78. I was just looking at the obituaries the other day. Unfortunately, starting about 15 years ago, about half a dozen or so of my good relatives have died. My half sister, her husband, my cousin's wife, and others. We've had friends and relatives dying at all the ages, not just 100. That's ridiculous. We've had friends and relatives dying in young elementary school, below the age of 10, in people we've known in friends in high school and young adulthood, terminal illnesses mostly, and suicides connected to terminal illnesses. And one or two have suffocated on the old time exhaust fumes of old time automobiles, like back in the 1960s or 1970s. I believe one was accidental that I knew of, and one was, well, I shouldn't say that. One or two were intentional due to terminal illness. One man I know was a great friend of mine, and I believe he shot himself in the head when he was in his 30s, back around in the 1980s, I believe it was, because he apparently had a terminal illness. A lot of these people, we used to have a lot more coverage of our suburb that we lived in, Fox Point. At one point, there may have been half a dozen newspapers covering Fox Point, a couple of them dailies. And of course, that's a lot different than nowadays. There are zero newspapers that cover Fox Point other than the Journal Sentinel Milwaukee. And that certainly, it was a lot easier to get a job in that when I came out of high school and college. There were at least half a dozen newspapers that covered Fox Point, a couple dailies and some weeklies and stuff. And of course, attrition, they went out of business over the years, or they got bought by the Journal Sentinel and then went out of business after the Journal Sentinel bought them. I could predict that all along. The Journal buys anything in Wisconsin and it becomes extinct. They don't know how to maintain a small independent newspaper. Which is why I like living and working in Eau Claire. The Leader Telegram was a smallish, independent daily when I worked at it in 1986 and 87. It had a circulation of 45,000. I was never known to be a political editor. I worked heavily with the Associated Press Wire. I was not known to be a storyteller or a fictitious person or a political person. I did not do a lot of work with the editorials on the editorial page at most newspapers, but I did do some page layout and headline writing work for editorial pages up at the Ashland Daily Press. That thing circulation was between 5 and 10,000, I believe, and I was up there for a year as wire editor, and then I went down to Eau Claire, several hundred miles, I believe, south of there, and I did work as a as a weekend wire editor. More accurately, I was one of several people who worked on the wire, and I was, one of our new group that was hired to work on the brand new weekend editions of the Leader Telegram in Eau Claire. So I did not have a lot to do with the regular Monday through Thursday wire editor. I did come on and do the live wire editing Friday and Saturday is called Weekend Wire Editor. But Monday through Friday, most of the time, I was working on the feature stories in the weekend edition, not writing them, but dumbing them on pages, writing headlines and stuff. Working with an interim managing editor named Rhonda, who was improving the appearance, the display layout of the whole newspaper very well at that time, and the design of the whole newspaper. She never admitted she was an interim managing editor, but she was the highest paid person in the newsroom for 6 months after the editor left. I never really worked with the previous editor. I did meet her. She wrote an excellent book, which without that book, I could never have worked at the Leader Telegram. I forgot her name, but she was a little before my time there. I met her as she was leaving and going to a computer company, and she was pregnant with her first or second child. And she had written a hundreds of pages manual about the Leader Telegram and how to do all the work in the newsroom and the company and so on. It was a very good book. Lots of diagrams. I could never have worked there without that. Usually, most newspapers are a lot more difficult to work with back in those days in Wisconsin. They're supposed to give you written material telling you how to use the computers and how the newspaper works, and very many of them in the Midwest, in Wisconsin and Illinois, never make this material available. It's supposed to be in the production rooms and in the newsroom, so you can just look stuff up, how to do something on the computer or the printing presses. Most newspapers in the Midwest in those days were really just horrible with that kind of thing. You had to ask everything out loud, and when you're new, and the other people were tremendously busy and were facetious and would not help you. So when I got this huge hundreds of pages book about how to, the moves to make on the computer to publish stories, and where you're not the writer but where you're the copy editor, this was just, so she put together that book before she left, and she supposedly went to a computer company in Eau Claire, and she and her husband was a reporter at the newspaper, were on their first or second child, and she was pregnant when she left. She was a pizza type editor who would sit around the newsroom a lot, order out for pizza and shirt sleeves and stuff like that. So I did get told by the Associated Press when I was at Eau Claire, I got hired there because they thought it was the easiest daily newspaper to work at in Wisconsin. Circulation 45,000, about an hour and a half east of the Twin Cities, and a casual, easy work environment. Some of the other newspapers were a little hectic, where they don't have any guidebook or handbook that tells you how to do anything on a computer or a printing press or anything. And you have to sit there even though it's busy and there's deadlines, and you have to come in extra and hit all the buttons on the thing and hit all the controls and try to figure it out manually. And other people are in your position and so on. They're not able to or not willing to assist you. As I said, I was the wire editor, also called night editor, at the Daily Press in Ashland for a year before going to Eau Claire. Now my leaving with Eau Claire, again, the voice lies and tries to claim I was terminated from jobs. I left Eau Claire, and I knew it was a very bad decision for me to leave there, but well, that's a little different matter than what I was talking about here with politics, but it had been years since I'd gone out on a date, and I reported accurately to the newspaper, working there as the weekend wire editor. that I seemed to meet women in Eau Claire and in the Twin Cities who liked me a lot, and they weren't able to show up for dates for some reason, and I could not figure out why. And that at that time that I told people at the newspaper, that was 1987, that had been going on at Milwaukee, Eau Claire, and the Twin Cities since 1982 was the last time I had a serious woman show up for a date, 1982 in Milwaukee. So I left the Eau Claire newspaper in order to figure this out at my own expense, which was a very bad decision. And I went out to Los Angeles and Hollywood to try to figure this out. And the same thing happened. I met a woman who liked me a lot in the clubs in Los Angeles, in addition to meeting hundreds of people. And she was not able to show up for a date ever. I had her first name and her phone number. And so I had evidence this was some kind of weird invasion of privacy or unlawful electronic harassment or unlawful surveillance. And unfortunately, when I was up at Eau Claire, 3 out of 4 of the workers in the newsroom were single and had similar problems, not as bad as mine. And anyway, the voice here from outer space was trying to connect me somehow to politics, and that's an extremely bad idea. I don't connect well to that at all. Neither do my relatives. My parents gave me the advice never. I had older parents not to run for an office. They did not think I was a political person. The last time I ever ran for anything was ordered as homework in elementary school. I ran for a newspaper editor in like the 3rd grade or something and was elected newspaper editor for a homework assignment or something. I've never seriously run for anything. I can't remember ever seriously influencing people or persuading them or controlling them or anything like that. I generally connect to general employment, which is what this video is about. I made other ones like this, and I label part of the headline on it FBI. Even being at newspapers, they usually let their most experienced local newsroom workers work on the editorial page. That people going through town or people who don't have a lot of experience, they don't normally have them write columns or editorials or work on the editorial page a lot, headlines. So I don't connect. I believe Trump recently started campaigning again, and he was outside of the state I'm in at the moment, Florida. And sometimes when this happens, I get a voice claiming that I cost Trump his last election and that I'm a Republican or a right-wing Republican. And unfortunately, that's not true. I've been voting for candidates in both political parties. I don't think it's extremely important for me to vote. Even the last election, this is 2023. I think the last election was the 2020, and I believe I voted in Fox Point, Wisconsin, and I was most interested in, I voted for 3 Democrats, 1 Republican, 1 independent, and 1 write-in, and I was most interested in the independent and the write-in that I voted for. I was not real interested in the 3 Democrats or the 1 Republican. As I said, I did not campaign for any of those people. I have no connections to any of them. Whether it's Donald Trump or Joseph Biden, I did not campaign for either one of them and have almost no connections to them. I did telephone the Biden, I attempted to telephone them. It's very hard nowadays. Back in the old days, in my era, you could just phone the governor of Wisconsin, or you could just phone Johnny Carson at the National Tonight Show, like Jay Leno or whatever. You could just phone them, and the people on their staffs and them answered telephones, and you could talk to their staff at least. Like I could just phone the governor of Wisconsin and the phone would get answered and his staff or the governor would be on the phone. Nowadays, there's nothing like that. There's all kinds of computers and red tape and voice messages and voice answering machines, and the odds of getting through to live people are really, really low. Like I called the Harlequin Book Company the other day, and they just have a recording on. The Simon and Schuster Book Company says it's so busy with unsolicited manuscripts that they can't read any of them. They have to have everything presented to them through a literary agent. This voice from space has been saying for the past 10 years that I can only work at the Simon and Schuster Book Company and that I have to get hired there via the telephone. I've phoned that one hundreds of times. It's always automated and it's the same message. You have to know somebody there or know the right people, and or you have to have a literary agent or a lawyer representing you. A regular citizen like myself cannot just phone Simon and Schuster or Donald Trump or Joseph Biden or Harlequin up in Canada and get people that like you or are concerned about you or get any person. It's all just red tape, voice messages, procedures, policies, rules, laws, answering machines. So I guess I have, first of all, did I cost Trump the election, which is what the voice from space has been saying for the past 2 years? No, I did not campaign for him. I did not vote for him. I did not campaign for Biden, and I did vote for Biden in a private voting booth. And I followed my older parents' advice from way back in the 1970s not to attempt to get involved a lot in politics. They didn't think I was a good choice for that. I just generally connect to general employment. When I'm in Florida here, the first time I came to Florida was 2004, and people thought they were informing me. They said, you don't have to carry a book with you or paperwork. I've been in Florida the past couple of years here, and this is now 23, 22, and 21, 2021 to now, and people have told me the same thing when they've spotted me with a book or in my car or carrying one. They've said, you don't have to carry books around Florida. You don't have to have paperwork here. I was mostly a wire editor at daily newspapers, also a sports editor. People knew I liked sports a lot and would encourage me. The sports guys would let me help them sometimes. And I did do sports editor 1 year at the Portage Daily Register in 1992. And also at the weekly newspapers Lakeland in 1984. I was sports editor a couple times, and people knew I liked that and followed the Packers and Bears around the Milwaukee area, and the Milwaukee Bucks back in those days, and like the Boston Celtics and Lakers and stuff like that. So electronic harassment, unlawful electronic surveillance, invasion of privacy, blacklisting, conspiracy. That's how these videos started uploading to YouTube, because they were waking me up at night and asking me about this or telling me things that were wrong. So the video gives me a chance to spout off a little. And I have no background of controlling elections or influencing them. I don't cost any politician an election, or I don't help any of them. Or our family was just a friend of Clement Zablocki, the rank and file Democrat from Milwaukee, back in the 1950s, where we visited his house. And I did campaign in one election, one weekend or 2 weekends, whatever it was. I did successfully some telemarketing work for, at that time, a liberal Democrat farmer from Utah named Morris Udall. And I did observe they were probably playing tricks on me in politics. When I campaigned for him out of the Nicolay High School, I did so because he was the only national candidate who visited the Nicolay High School. So since he was the only one who visited me at Nicolay High School, that's the only candidate I've ever been willing to campaign for. He visited Nicolay High School and gave us a little presentation, so I campaigned for him. And I saw the politicians were trying to play a trick. They sort of knew about Michael Kajowski back there, Nicolay High School. I believe after Udall ran as a liberal Democrat, he switched over and became a right-wing Republican later in the 1980s. And I viewed that as a trick they were trying to play on me. But when I was a teenager back then, I campaigned, just like I said, one night or one weekend, doing the telephone work for, at that time, the liberal Democrat Morris Udall from Utah. And I believe I read in the newspaper later in the 70s or in the 80s that he switched over, became a right-wing Republican, a farmer or businessman in Utah, and no longer involved in politics. I believe there was a famous presidential candidate like that named Gary Hart who ran as a Democrat and got involved in some kind of scandal, and he did not get elected, though he was popular and got a lot of votes, influenced the election. I think his name was Gary Hart from Colorado. And then once that election ended, I never heard anything about him again. He probably became a businessman or a computer guy or something in Colorado or out west. And I don't remember him running for president again. Maybe he did run once or twice. I don't know. So in other words, my parents advised me long ago in my situations not to get involved in politics. I don't seem like I feel, correctly or incorrectly, that politics is unfairly slanted toward the British and Irish ethnic heritages in the United States. A lot of the successful politicians in this country, from I'm calling George Washington successful, or Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson, a lot of them to me seem to be the British and Irish ethnic heritages, unless I've got that wrong. I don't see a lot. I have a Polish surname, Kujawski. I don't see a lot of Poles in politics in this country, in the United States, especially with that war in Ukraine going on. I don't see a lot of Ukrainians getting elected to offices here or whatever. So I'm saying it doesn't matter a lot who I vote for. I don't campaign for them, and I don't campaign against people. So I did not cost Trump any election. That's his own fault that he lost, or that the public is blaming him for rioting or violence. That must be the way he handled himself as a TV personality. I did not watch Trump ever when he was on TV. The types of shows he was on, I'm not familiar with them, and I did not watch those. I maybe saw 10 minutes of one episode of some show he was on where he was trying to tell people what to do for a living, or something like that, or predict the future or something. I did not pay attention to that. I did read Trump's book back in the 1980s when I was a young man, a young adult. He wrote a book about all the red tape at the government, or he wrote some kind of nonfiction book. He supposedly wrote it, though one of his wives was a novelist, and I'm sure he hired professional writers to help him, or ghostwriters, or literary agents. I did read his published book, though, whatever it was called, the Luck of the Draw or something like that. He had several of them, I believe. I read one of them back in the 1980s, and I don't recall him clearly stating at that time, when he was a younger gentleman, that he was a Republican or Democrat. Now here he's been running as a Republican. And like I said, when he runs, I get a voice from outer space where he is making errors, and they blame his errors on me. And that's ridiculous. I voted for Biden. I did not campaign for Biden, and I did not cost Trump or Biden any election. Trump's making the same mistakes that some of the Republican failures make. He does not communicate well with the whole public. he would have to be a more polite gentleman and a more reasonable person. Some of the riots that took place during the coronavirus, there were Democrat riots around the United States, trashing police cars and stuff. And there was the famous Republican riot in Washington, D.C., where they apparently broke into politicians' offices and attempted to trash them. Um, so if Trump were a polite gentleman politician, he would acknowledge some of that whole thing was his fault. Certainly not all of it, but to have a person in the United States, whether it's me or anybody, who says, "Oh no, none of that was my fault," that's ridiculous. I mean, somebody who expects to get elected with comments like that doesn't make a lot of sense. Some of that was people's fault. And a lot of those riots in Seattle and around the United States looked like regular citizens like myself, independent voters who vote on a person by person or case by case basis, or Democrats. So I see those national politicians have gotten carried away with finger pointing, and unfortunately, it leads people like me to believe that they're not mature, that they're immature, and not seasoned professionals. And, you know, but during the coronavirus, the public stood up for its rights as best as it could. It conducted riots all around the United States. And I think the public was saying they thought the coronavirus was not just the fault of one, like, modern day peasant researcher in China, but was coming from the authority figures and the rich people in the United States, Great Britain, Europe, the Middle East, and around the world. To try to blame that all on one person or one group does not make sense to a lot of adults in the United States. I don't think they would support that or vote for that. It's obviously a worldwide problem with all the authority figures and a lot of the rich people and so on. So now this voice goes over the small number of famous people that I've met in my lifetime, and one of them was Mike Ditka. I met him in the approximately 1984, my first sports editor job at Lakeland Weekly Newspapers, northwest of Illinois. And he behaved very weirdly, as I'd seen before, where fortunately I had an appointment with him to interview him about the Bears. I believe he was coach of the Bears and used to be a tight end. And he later became a national broadcaster. Fortunately, I got there and there was a ring of reporters, about a dozen. And fortunately, I took notes and wrote down the questions and answers. Well, then my appointment came and I looked around the hallway and the other reporters had left and it was just Mike Ditka there. And he seemed to know my identity as some other national people have. And he seemed to not be cooperating with me and wouldn't answer my questions. So fortunately, I had notes from the earlier press conference. And he seemed to just be insulting me. He would just go yes and no, so I couldn't get quotes from him. And he would tell me he thought I would fail as a newspaper sports editor, and he thought I would fail at any level of journalism, whether it was the Chicago Sun-Times or Chicago Tribune or the small Lakeland newspapers. He thought I was a terrible news worker and would fail, and I didn't know how he knew my identity or why. So, you're rushing around. When I later got back to the weekly newsroom, I thought, that helps me a little to have witnesses that this took place. That wasn't the only incident like that. I've been in other ones. It helps me have witnesses, and I thought if I put a little of it in my news story about Ditka, it'll only fill up 2 paragraphs or something. It was just weird. I had one of those in college also. It was my first one of my first writing classes at the journalism school in the late 1970s at UW-Madison, and I went out to interview like a very esteemed professor who was running something in medical science. I was doing a fictitious magazine article for magazine writing class, and my article was about migraine headaches. And when I went out to interview this leader of a campus clinic who had all sorts of awards, and he did the same thing. There were no witnesses in his office. I'd ask him questions. He'd just go yes and no. He seemed to, so I had to paraphrase, and he seemed to know my identity and was just insulting me and not cooperating with me. I also had a couple of college professors who were like that. One for feature writing class for daily newspapers at the journalism school, who had been a reporter at the Milwaukee Journal, and another one who had been a reporter for the Boston Globe and the Associated Press in Boston, and also for the Atlantic Monthly National Magazine, and his favorite one was the Scientific American National Magazine, and he also worked, I think, as a science writer for the Associated Press in Boston. And I saw he did this as a tactic with a lot of his students. He was required by the campus rules to give us our grades, but he wouldn't send our paperwork back to us with the grades on them, just the grades coming out on the report cards that you got in the mail from UW-Madison. That was pre-internet back in those days, in the late 1970s. So I went to his office to get my magazine articles back to see how he scored each article or how he graded each one, and he refused to give them back to me. And he had a big stack of them from his magazine writing class. He was doing this with all the students. They had to sort of like beg him or something to get their articles back. So I noticed most of the students did not return the following semester to get their articles back, but I did, and he wouldn't make an appointment, and he was disagreeable, and he had me come to his office half a dozen times. He finally did give them back to me, and the highest grade I think on any of them was a B plus, and I think the lowest was a B minus. So I have no logical reason why he would withhold something like that. I noticed on the report card I got in the mail, I got a B in the magazine writing class. But he yelled at me quite a bit in that class and seemed to know my identity and was insulting me and stuff. And he was willing to give me a job recommendation, oral, whatever that was. I didn't know what that was back in those days. He noted I didn't have a resume, whatever that was. I didn't know what that was back in those days. And he was willing to give me this job recommendation, oral, only for weekly newspapers. He was not willing to recommend me for an internship to like magazines. Like there was a leading student in the class who had done one or two magazine internships in New York or something like that. And so I was not one of that. There was another woman in the class who had graduated, and she's coming back taking the magazine class, and she was working as a full-time secretary in Madison. So I was just a regular student, got a B on my report card in the class, and I saw he graded most of my papers. I believe the range of B plus to B minus, but he did yell at me quite a bit, as did this Milwaukee Journal professor. This Milwaukee Journal professor is a different one, a feature writing class. I handed everything late. He was nice enough to accept it and grade it. Like the other professors, marked everything down. Like if you got an A, he marked it down to a B. If you got a B, he marked it down to a C down to a D because you handled it in late. They thought they were pretty lenient because some professors would just give you an F and would not accept anything late. I went around with a friend of mine who broke his leg or sprained his leg, signed his cast. Went around at the end of the semester to help him with his crutches, and the same thing. Some professors would just give him an F if he didn't turn the work in. I had, I believe, one broadcasting. I took the print journalism sequence, but I did have one broadcasting professor who would not accept anything late, and I either dropped his class or got a C in it or a D in it. I can't remember. He would not accept anything late. Most of the professors accepted stuff late, but they mark it down one grade. So if you got a B on it and they accepted it late, they marked the whole thing, the project or whatever, down to a C. I had a B grade point average when I graduated from the UW-Madison. I was from the School of Journalism in the print journalism sequence. I did not successfully take any classes in advertising or TV broadcasting or radio broadcasting. I was just print journalism with newspapers, feature stories, dummy news pages, and magazine articles. And as I said, occasionally I ran into national people in childhood and so on, and most of them seemed to know my identity and yelled at me and stuff, and I found a lot of fault with me, criticized me a lot, ridicule. And I did pass it on to my father, who was alive at the time, and my grandfather. My grandfather died in 1987 at the age of 87. His wife died in the 1970s at 66. My grandparents on the other side, I believe my father's father died in his 70s, was a church organist in Chicago. I believe his mother lived to be my grandmother on the Polish side lived to be in her late 80s. Let's see, my cousin died at age 52, his wife 48. My other cousin's wife, I was reading her obituary yesterday, died at 75, I think it was, in 2015. My half-sister died at age 73, 10 years ago, in 2013. My cousin's wife, I have a surviving cousin who's 82. His wife, like I said, died at age 75 in 2015. My half-sister's husband also died in 2015 at age 78. So a good average age for us with the Polish and German and that ethnic heritages. None of us are the British or Irish ethnic heritages in the United States. Is most of us have lived to be 73 to 78. Nowhere near 100 or 110 or the world record holders around 120 or whatever. Nowhere near any of that. I don't think Polish generally live quite as long as, let's say, like British or, Italian or something else, French. I've only been to Europe, just transferring airplanes. I transferred planes at the London airport. And on the way to China, I visited Berlin, Germany for 3 days and 3 nights. I believe I stopped over once. I can never remember the name of it in the Middle East. For one night, it was either Dubai or Abu Dhabi. I can't remember which one it was. I slept overnight at the airport in a rented motel room. I didn't venture out into the city. I believe it was Dubai, probably, but I always get confused because they sound like each other. I can never remember. Was it Abu Dhabi or Dubai? The main thing is when you look out the plane window, you see all the modern new buildings they have down there. They have some modern new office buildings in those Mideast cities. So Dubai and Abu Dhabi are in United Arab Emirates along the border of Saudi Arabia. I never stopped in Saudi Arabia. I believe you have to have like visas or special permissions for that one. But a lot of the planes used to stop over in Korea. I did work in South Korea, in Busan, and up toward the Seoul area for 8 months in 2009 and 2010. And I really liked Busan down at the southern end down there. I was never really officially in Seoul. I worked at a small mountain village about an hour away from Seoul for, I think it was 1 month or 1.5 months. I was down around Busan, I think it was, for 6 months. The planes usually stop Because I've been over there to Asia at least half a dozen times. It's a very long trip. You feel sore in your airplane seat and you really can't stand it. You have to sit in a seat for at least 12 hours to 20 to 24 hours. So obviously you get up to get a little exercise and walk around. Very long time in an airplane seat. So when I was sharper, I tried to break it up and just stop someplace so I could get a break. The Japan airport, it was like I was in an electric chair. They had a huge, colossal airplane with 3 decks. I've been in the Japan airport more than once, changing planes. Never slept there. It's near Tokyo. These airports nowadays are all about 30, 40, 50 kilometers away from a big city. They list it as Tokyo, but it's like everything else, like 40 kilometers or whatever outside the big city. I've never seen Tokyo or slept there overnight, but some of my planes have stopped for me to change planes in Tokyo, a number of them. Seoul, Korea is another place where they've changed planes. I'm a little familiar with their airport up there. And I'm trying to think of other places. As I said, it was one of those Dubai or Abu Dhabi in United Arab Emirates stops to change planes. Very sunny and hot there. And I did voluntarily pick Berlin once, a little more expensive, but gives you a break that you can get out for a few days and get away from the electric chair or whatever that is, the numbness in the arms and legs connected to the airports. I did see Berlin, Germany a little for several days. Reminded me of Milwaukee. And I took a tour bus of it, and not a lot of people on the tour bus. Like Milwaukee, most folks, local German people, and they were working. And they did have a subway there, and a lot of that old stuff from the Nazis and Adolf Hitler had aged and was torn down or had fallen down, replaced by new modern buildings. And the Berlin Wall and that had a little graffiti on it at that point and had weathered away, and most of it had been torn down or removed. So I've never visited Poland. Only transferred airplanes in London, never visited Ireland, France, Paris, or Italy, or Greece, or Albania, or never been along the Mediterranean, just to Dubai or Abu Dhabi. And also one night where I didn't get any rest or sleep at the airport in Qatar. I forgot what the name of the Doha, Qatar. Run around, make sure I'm in the right spot, and change airplanes there. It was very hot and humid at that one. It was not air conditioned. Resting and sleeping in my chair. That was one of my first trips over to Asia, maybe the first one. Made the plane change on time, and I do remember it was hot and humid. And their impression of Americans, they think Americans do nothing but drink liquor and coffee, and they try hard to have you drink some liquor at the airport or to sell you some liquor. And of course, if you're a first-time traveler, you're probably careful and cautious. I do remember having some good stiff drinks at the Detroit airport, transferring planes and traveling around. They had some real good ones at the Detroit airport. I can remember being at a Brewers game once in Milwaukee where they had a very good Bloody Mary there, just filled with some food in it, pickles and a lemon or something, and very spicy, good, like a cold soup, Bloody Mary. So, and I do remember one of those at the Detroit airport also. They had some good bars there at that one. I usually left from the O'Hare airport. Usually I rushing around, don't have time. The restaurant you have to kind of get to, I never understand this. You have to get to the restaurant before you board the plane. When you get off the plane at the O'Hare airport, you don't have as easy a lot of access to restaurants. Nowadays, they've got that covered. Those planes have 3 meals on them, and there's a lot of food eating on them. That's one of the main things they do, because Unfortunately, you're trapped in your seat. In the future, they're going to have to come up with ways out of this stuff, but that's the big problem with air flight nowadays. This is 2023. The last time I flew a plane internationally was 2019, before the coronavirus. Had there not been a coronavirus, I would have returned to China to be with my Chinese girlfriend and to work. I'd prefer to teach classes there. Unfortunately, the last time I was not employed. I was there in 2019 for about 6 months in Shenzhen, and I never found work there, but I did save some money doing my mother's paperwork there. She was alive at that time, and that was before the coronavirus, which started in 2020, that the most of the public became aware of it. It did get underway in 2019, but myself and most of the public was not aware of it. But I was in Shenzhen for 6 months. 2019, did not find employment, which is very unusual. Did do a couple stints for free, which I don't like to, just get paid a meal. My first serious work in Shenzhen was 2014 to 15. I was at a high school, middle, and elementary complex for 1 year, which was good. And I guess I didn't figure out how to stay there permanently, which I should have done. The man there, the principal, was also a politician, I believe, some kind of like local alderman type thing. That was at the Yaohao Experimental School. I was there for 1 year in Shenzhen. Let's see, before that, I was at a college, and I believe they were trying to hire me permanently, and I didn't catch it on time. I wasn't alert. I had a 8-month contract, and I only stayed for 5. I left early because my half-sister Christine had terminal cancer in the U.S., and I wanted to visit with her, which was a bad decision on my part. You're better off, here's advice, better off sticking with your job and your career. When you try to visit the relatives when they're dying and stuff, I don't think it works out. It doesn't help anything. I'm not a doctor or a nurse. I have several relatives who are nurses. My half-sister Christine was the most esteemed of us. Was the one probably with the highest IQ. She had a master's degree in nursing and taught nursing at Milwaukee Area Technical College. She's the only relative I know of who got a master's degree. I just have a bachelor's degree. My sister also graduated from the UW-Milwaukee School of Nursing. She doesn't like it known. I believe she was on the dean's list. My mother, Miriam, had a C grade point average at UW-Madison, where she became a writer briefly before she met my father. She wrote for a radio station in Iowa, and also for the Schuster's department store, where she met my father in downtown Milwaukee, and also a factory in Milwaukee named Rexnord. She always lamented the fact that they didn't have maternity leave in those days, so when she became pregnant with me, she had to leave her very good jobs at Rexnord and or at Schuster's department store. None of them had maternity leave. And those were good jobs for her, especially at Rexnord. She was an executive secretary at Rexnord, which was a good job for her, and she had to leave those things due to they did not have maternity leaves to have her children, Michael and Mary Beth. When she returned to college after having a C grade point average, she went back in the 1970s and got a teacher's license, which I have not been able to do, and she also made the dean's list at UW-Milwaukee, but that was as someone who already had a bachelor's degree and a C grade point average. She did go back in her 40s or 50s or whatever it was and got a teacher's license. I haven't been able to do that, neither has my sister. So let's see, my half-sister had a master's degree and was a instructor at Milwaukee Area Technical College, and my mother went back when she was middle-aged in 40s or 50s and got a Wisconsin teacher's license and went from being a C student to being on the dean's list also. And so those were the only two who did teaching work in our blood relations. My sister doesn't like it known. She graduated, was on the dean's list also as an undergraduate at Milwaukee, because she just had a B grade point average in high school and elementary school. And so she was the second one in our family to graduate from a school of nursing from the UW Milwaukee. Then there was a third one from the School of Nursing in UW Milwaukee, my sister's oldest daughter, Dana. She was also on the dean's list there and graduated. So with three of them graduated. My half sister, Christine, who's deceased, died at age 73 in 2013. My sister, Mary Beth, who's up in her 60s, around my age, and her oldest daughter, Dana. I don't know how she is. She's old. She's probably middle-aged. All three of them graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee as undergraduates from the School of Nursing. Now, someone like myself, I'm just horrible with science subjects. I get C's, D's, and F's in them, and I wouldn't even get accepted to a nursing school at UW Milwaukee or at any place. I could only have majored in communications or philosophy or English or journalism. That's all I can graduate from college in with a college degree. As I said, I graduated UW-Madison in December 1980 with a B grade point average, and I could not have majored in a science subject out there like agriculture or farming or nursing or anything like that. I get horrible grades on that. I can try my hardest and get a C in it. I get C's, D's, and F's and stuff like that. So that's what the voice is interrogating me on. So I have had three relatives who've worked as nurses and graduated from the UW Milwaukee School of Nursing and were accepted in the first place. Myself, with my horrible science performance, I'm just no good at that type of thing. I've only had one relative, my half-sister Christine, who I've known to have a master's degree. My father, Marion Kajowski, informed me sometime in childhood he did not graduate from high school, and they did not have a GED back in Chicago in those days. He was always insecure about his writing work and asked me and my mother, who were the writers in our family, to look over his written material and to try to fix it up for him. He was better than all of us at being a popular person. He was local. He was popular with people, always had hundreds of friends and contacts and business associates. He worked in sales all his life, and he did not go to college, and he had a bad chip on his shoulder due to that. He insisted I had to go to college, and he thought the college boys had it made and always got all the breaks out in the job world. He was born, I believe, back in 1911 and died in 1985, age 73. And we've had at least a half dozen of us who died from serious cancer, not able to overcome it. And he was one of them. When he was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and he had cancer all over his body, and they couldn't do anything to help him. I currently have a relative in the hospital now, my sister's husband, and it's a similar, he's bad shape with cancer, pneumonia, lung cancer, and in the hospital. I've had other relatives who've been hospitalized with cancer. So it's been a problem for all of us. And then what I'm saying is people sometimes think that I might be the one with the highest IQ in our family. I don't think so. I've had three close relatives who've graduated from, like I said, the UW Milwaukee School of Nursing. I can't even get into that. I'm just a liberal arts major back in those days. And like I said, my half-sister Christine, who died 10 years ago, was the only one of us that I know of who achieved a master's degree. She got it and paid for it herself. She did the whole thing herself, and she taught nursing at the Milwaukee Area Technical College. She's the only one of us that I know of that got a postgraduate degree. And then, as I said, several of my relatives have been on dean's lists at UW Milwaukee. My mother, my sister, and her oldest daughter I've never been on a dean's list. I just had a B grade point average. Skills and abilities testing at for me as a job applicant at the U.S. military and at car dealerships in the United States, and also at the highly rated Nicolay High School and Bayside Elementary School. I generally come out my highest ability or skill natural is math. I rank 90 in math, so I'm not like Steve Jobs or William Gates. I'm not off the charts. I'm not a genius like Einstein or something. The highest score I get in anything, skills and abilities, adult or child or anything, is 90 in math, which is above the average range of 75 to 83. 87 in overall English, 90 in the creative writing component of English, but only 83 in the reading comprehension component of English. People who are only 83 in the reading comprehension component of English skills and abilities don't have to be hired as writers either locally or nationally. And overall 83 in science. So none of that is off the charts. None of that is Steve Jobs or Einstein or whatever. I'm completely not one of that. So the things erasing my mind. This is extemporaneous. I still make a better impression when I write out a script. Like I start off with an essay to begin with, and can make it into a script, and then it goes faster. This is the first draft stage, this recording here. I did work at newspapers for approximately 5 years. I was one of several wire editors at the Leader Telegram in Eau Claire. My official title was called Weekend Wire Editor, but I was the worker on the wire who seemed to have the most potential for the future until I shocked them and up and left and went to California, which they advised me not to do. And as I explained, it was not related to the Leader Telegram. I liked working there. It was due to a lack of a date life. And then the worst problems I've had have not been with dating. They've been with unlawful satellite surveillance, blacklisting, conspiracy from a satellite, and unlawful invasion of privacy were the worst problems I've had in my lifetime. Were a bad sleep problem that I still have. I've had interrupted sleep from 1988 to the present in 2023. The worst of it being 1988 and 89 for an 18-month block. 17 months out of the 18, I only got 45 minutes of interrupted rest each night for 17 months, 1988 to 89, which was horrible. And then I got only 3 hours and 45 minutes of interrupted rest for 5 years after that, 1989 to 1994. Then since 1994, I've been sleeping more, 6 to 9 hours a night, sometimes 10, 12, sometimes 3 days. But it's been interrupted sleep since then, usually 6 to 9 hours. I have not slept soundly consistently since 1987. So that has been one horrible problem, interrupted rest. And the words are different. People get confused. They think, how could you have been a security guard when you were sleeping? Well, that's not the job description. They've got that wrong from the get-go. They're just wrong. Each post is different. It's like I'm saying, it's a case-by-case basis. Some small percentage of posts, I worked for about half a dozen to a dozen security agencies in Houston from 2005 until, seriously, until 2009, but off and on until 2022. And I worked for one security agency in Milwaukee back in the 1970s. No two posts are the same. They all have different rules. So some small percentage of posts do allow you, as they did their original security guy from their own company. I was always with security agencies, not on the payroll of the company where I do the security. A small percentage of them allow you to throw back 1 or 2 beers at night. So, for instance, when I was at drilling structures, the workers told me it's okay for the third shift security guy to have 1 or 2 beers. I don't know if I ever did that. Maybe I did that just one night, but I don't remember. But each post is different. Dozing, resting, and napping, and sleeping and deep sleep are all vocabulary terms that have different meanings. Most security agencies and posts do not want deep sleep or sound sleep or necessarily sleep, but some security posts on a case by case basis do allow resting, dozing, and napping. When I was up in northern Wisconsin at the newspapers in Ashland and Eau Claire, I only brought a 6-pack into the newsroom once in Eau Claire, and a couple guys split it with me. We had 2 for one of my fellow copy editors on the wire desk, 2 beers, 2 for myself, 2 for him, and 2 for our friend, the business editor, who was sitting the other side of us. It's generally known the outdoor editor can have beers when he's out there covering the outdoors. He's away from his desk a lot. I knew that when I was a little kid on the south side of Milwaukee. If you move from Milwaukee when you're a big person and an adult, and you go up to Ashland or Green Bay or northern Wisconsin, Wausau, which was supposedly heavily Polish, or Rhinelander, or any place, it's okay to drink and drive up there. It's okay to have beers, and it's okay to bring your alcohol into your job. Like if you have a little shop up in Ashland, a little fishing shop, or retirement deal, or a little luggage shop, it's okay to have 1 or 2 beers up there. I only did that once in Eau Claire. I brought a 6-pack into the newsroom once. And as I said, 3 of us divided 2 apiece, second shift. I was told I could drink all I wanted to on the second shift at Ashland, and I never did. I used to put it off. I always met the deadline, which was midnight. No matter what happened, a space shuttle can explode. Oliver North can go under the scrutiny of the Congress. The Marcos family can abdicate in the Philippines. These were wire stories that came up. I worked heavily on the wire, but when I was up at Ashland, I usually made the deadline, left work by midnight. I did not throw back a beer with the production workers until after I was off duty, and I would go to a bar like at midnight. Walking home, I would walk home a lot up in freezing Ashland, and of course, I couldn't make it with all the snow piles and everything back to my warm apartment. I couldn't get back there without stopping at least one bar along the way. So I'd stop at 1 or 2 bars after work because I could get to a TV. I didn't have a TV in my apartment. I didn't want one, so I could concentrate on the newspaper. So there'd be some sports on a TV. I'd have 1 or 2 at the bar, and people ask me, why don't you do that nowadays? You have a little more money now. Well, I'm older now, and the alcohol doesn't have the same effect. Back in those days, I was in my 20s. So if I drank a beer, I liked it. My body could handle it. Nowadays, unfortunately, I'm in my 60s, and the alcohol and stuff doesn't have the same coffee impact on your health. So this is what the voice wants me to comment on. I turn out to be a better person than what the voice claims. I don't cost any politicians in America to lose their jobs. That's incorrect. I'm a friend of lawyers and policemen. Generally, most of them have been friendly to me and good. Not all of them. Some of them have been bad. So the voice wants me to comment on this stuff. First of all, let me tell you about one of my big supporters, 1989. I was having a horrendous unemployment problem. I'd been unemployed for 6 months, and back in those days, I didn't have money. I couldn't, living at my mother's house, and her money was all tied up, frozen in a lawsuit. So we were really short on cash. I was unemployed for 6 months there, the longest ever at that time. Now, since then, over my lifetime, my accumulated unemployment, which is why the voice is harassing me, has piled up to 20 years. Not 20 years in a row, because that sounded like a horror movie the way I said it. I have not been unemployed 20 consecutive years, but the accumulation of my unemployment, just estimating it, a round figure, guessing, 20 years total unemployment for me. Now, obviously, I was ordered around by a voice during some of that, and I was ordered to paint 2 houses, for instance, during what I'm calling unemployment. 1989 and 90, I got ordered by a voice from outer space to paint my mother's house and to paint my grandfather's house. I also was ordered to mow their lawns and to mow a third lawn at a lake cottage, and ordered to trim the tree branches, cut the branches, and rake the leaves, and blah, blah, blah. This stuff obviously gave me some light exercise and took a lot of weight off. I was not allowed to ride a bike, as it was just too expensive. I had some old bikes from childhood, and they were in all bad shape, and I never had the cash to fix them up or buy a new one. I would have liked bike riding, but I had this horrendous sleep problem back then. Only 45 minutes of interrupted rest, or 3 hours and 45 minutes of interrupted rest. Now, when I worked in Houston, I went with it. I worked for about a dozen security agencies, 2005, mostly to 2009, but also a little in 2010 and 2018, I believe, and 2022. 2022 was the most disappointing one. I was with a security agency that I come and gone from them a half a dozen times. Each time he cuts my hours back, but he does let me come and go. Most of them, once you quit or you're terminated, you're gone for good. So he let me come and go at that one. But this last stint in 2022 was really lousy. I only got 80 hours total for the year of work. He was promising me full-time 40-hour work weeks and overtime. That God, I was with him for 2 months, and the average only turned out to be 20 hours a week, and you don't see the average till you fill out the timesheets yourself. That was my lowest totals with him. Previously, I'd been with that agency in 2018 at 30 hours per week, but that was steadier employment each week. This in 2022 was only 2 months. He would have me work for a couple 40 hours a week at the beginning of the month to sucker me. Then for 2 weeks, I wouldn't hear from him and work no hours. Then, for the first time ever, he didn't pay me on time. He normally paid promptly your paychecks every 2 weeks, but he had a ridiculous red tape deal where he had to go to his office and pick it up in person, which that takes half a day in a big city like Houston. So this time around, he had a sucker pitch. The first 2 weeks, he worked me 40 hours, so I thought he was on the level. Then the next 2 weeks, nothing. I didn't hear from the security agency. It was, in that case, it was MPS. I've worked for them a half a dozen times, he and his wife. And normally he paid promptly every 2 weeks, but a big rigmarole, you got to drive to his office and pick it up in person. That takes half a day in a city like Houston. He had an office on 610, the common freeway. So, what was I saying? So the last one, he's semi-retired. I believe he's in his 70s now, and he isn't making sense. The last person I talked to him about him said he was a crook, and they won't hire him anymore to supply security guards. That was for the MPS agency, and I was there 2 months. I worked the first 2 weeks of 1 month, like let's say August. And then the next 2 weeks, I didn't hear from him at all, which he normally does that. All the guards complain about it. So the average for the month turned out to be 20 hours a week, two 40-hour weeks followed by two 0-hour weeks. And of course, he suckers you. You thought the 0-hour weeks were going to be 40s also, or maybe even 50s or 60s. So 2 months of that, let's say like, August and September back there, when I started uploading these videos, and only come out to an average of 20 hours a week, and really lousy, only like $10 an hour. So that's the worst I've ever seen MPS. In 2018, it was 30 hours a week, but I had some hours each week. When I started with MPS in 2007, he was more honest. Hank was back in those days. It was probably about $8.50 an hour. But when you're brand new like that, he supplies the uniform and the badges and stuff. He encourages you to go through the state of Texas and get your gun license for security so you can be an armed commissioned officer, which I did in January of 2007. You do have to handle that yourself and pay for it yourself, but it costs about $1,000 with all the rigmarole. But the like I said, MPS back in those days, they recognize that a little, and they give you extra hours. They try to cover it, pay you back for it. So back in those days, when I started at MPS in January 2007, a regular work week for me with them was 55 hours, and a short week was 45 hours. So the security scene in Houston has changed a lot now, down to like two 40-hour weeks, then two 0-hour weeks, or an average of 20 hours a week and only $10 an hour, and blah, blah, blah. So back in those days, my first contact with security was UPS. I forgot what it stands for. Again, the farther we go back in time, the happier I am. As I'm younger and younger back there in a time tunnel, I don't have to be so aggressive. Some of these companies contact me. They heard about me from another employer. They heard about me from another newspaper or something, or from a conference of their businessmen. They heard I was looking for jobs in Milwaukee or whatever, and so employers used to contact me and solicit me. People would say, you say you're a shy person. Well, then how did you ever find jobs? Well, I used to start off in the 1970s, just looking for work, going in person, door to door. And after some hirings and jobs, I believe I was solicited by some places. So some of